got David in the house with us today. And David, how do you describe yourself? I know early on you were sort of a CG generalist, but what are you today?
I think that I tend towards like title sequences and concert visuals, and mostly like a 3D artist. I started as like an uber generalist, doing editing, color grading, and then kind of honed my focus into just like title sequences and 3D basically.
Yeah, and you grew up in Virginia, is that right?
Yep, grew up in Blacksburg, Virginia, and then I went to college at William & Mary, and went to grad school at UVA. So Virginia boy my whole life, and then moved to San Diego pretty recently.
Oh, and so you're in San Diego now?
Yeah, totally.
Gotcha.
Totally, and it's awesome.
That's why it's so sunny.
Yeah, exactly.
I read too that at UVA you were a neuroscience major. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. So I was on this weird science track until I was like 24 in 2011, and I got a bachelor's in neuroscience and philosophy, and then a master's in neuroscience. I was actually in the PhD program, and I switched down to get my master's and get out because I felt like a fraud, and I didn't want to talk to science nerds, and like it was cool like learning about science, but when it came to actually doing it, I figured out that you had to love it, and I didn't, so I kind of like retreated into sci-fi novels and swing dancing and other interests, but I think I discovered my love for filmmaking in undergrad, just making like dorky ass Zelda parodies and like Pokemon 300 mashups and stupid shit with my friends, and then I had like one job during the summers at this library in Tampa doing like podcast editing and like little documentary projects, and that was like, even just that was super fun for me. So I found my calling, but then I went back to grad school and kind of like ignored it, because my parents were academics, and they didn't trust that art was like a safe way of living, but they've since totally come around, and yeah.
I love that. What kind of academics were your parents?
My dad is a philosophy professor in USF Tampa. He's got his own thing going with Descartes. He's like one of the top Descartes scholars in the world, so wow. That's crazy in his own thing, and I love hearing about it. But yeah, I tried that out too in undergrad because I was like, oh, maybe I'll take up the family business, but yeah, that definitely wasn't for me either,
Interesting.
And I've always been drawn to like creativity and art for whatever reason. Yeah. And
Descartes is I think therefore I am.
That's the dude. Yeah.
That's the dude. That's his. That's what my Descartes scholarly gets you.
Yeah, that's about as. I mean, I don't know a whole lot more than that, honestly. Like, yeah.
I think just about every artist can relate to. My parents were skeptical about whether or not this was a lifelong career. Totally. I'm putting David's link to his website into the chat room, and let's talk a bit about your work. So here is David's website, which I strongly suggest y'all check out. He's got some insane work on here. But
credit to Schmoopy in the chat, by the way, for helping me rebrand my website. She did like web design for 10 years, and she super helped me like organize it. At first I had like one-man band written all over it, which was true for a while, but now I've like honed my focus to, rather than this uber generalist, more of like I just do Cinema 4D and Octane. That's what I'm best at, and that's where I really have fun playing. So that's really what I want to do. And yeah, she totally helped me rebrand this year, which is great. And it's definitely driven a lot more traffic, I think, to the site.
Shout out to Schmoop. So let's talk about while you were in Charlottesville. I know you sort of cut your teeth on working with Dave Matthews Band. Is that right?
Yeah, totally. I was hired at this company called Filament Productions, and they were like the only kind of cool company doing any kind of graphics work at the time. And I had some, AE and different experience. I'd done Final Cut and some other programs, and I was obsessed with, tutorials already. I discovered Video Copilot for sure, and I downed all those tutorials. I've always been addicted to tutorials as one of my main modes of learning. But yeah, this company was cool. They did visuals for Dave Matthews Band because he got his start in Charlottesville. And I spent 3.5 years there learning AE and then Cinema 4D. And then Octane, I found out about that in 2013 and started using that then. And it was a cool job because we got to basically art direct the content ourselves, because the band was pretty free about the visuals and didn't totally care that much what we made, or trusted our art director, who had this weird grungy dark aesthetic, So for years I was making this grunge, just like trying to dirty up everything, and CG was almost like this bad word to these people, but I mean, partly because I was new at it, I just started in 3D, and so it looked kind of shitty, but like, so they always wanted to put smear like textures and smudge stuff on it, to dirty it up, or just let's color this whole thing red,
right?
This beautiful thing that you worked on for so long, let's just turn it all red. But the cool part of the job was just the mad science feeling, working with my friends there. We do things like rent infrared hacked cameras to get that weird, like glowy, otherworldly look, where the skin is kind of translucent. I don't know if you're familiar with that look, but that was a fun little project. And kind of, I've always been really into sci-fi, so that kind of lends itself towards sci-fi, that look. Or we'd, rent a red epic and shoot super slow-mo footage of sand falling in a tank, and stuff like steel wool burning on black, like I just like scour the internet for little techniques, and steel wool, when it burns, creates all these little fires, and so shooting that in slow-mo, you get like all this interesting complexity for free, and then I would composite that into the sky of something. So yeah, just like crazy random stuff, like come up with concepts and just go to town. And I love playing like that. I love blank slates and just coming up with random shit. And yeah, it was a cool job. And at first I had difficulty communicating with the art director / DP guy, because I would tell him to go out and shoot something, and then it would come back and it would look totally different from how I imagined. And a big part of that was because I didn't have any experience with a camera myself. I didn't know what focal lengths meant, or what an f-stop was, or any of that kind of stuff, how to compose an image, really. So at some point I dropped my whole savings. I was like, fuck this, I want to get better at my job, even though I'm at a full-time company. Dropped my savings on cameras and started shooting. First, my gateway drug was just getting a GoPro, and before it even arrived, I was like, why would I just get a GoPro? This is stupid. I'm gonna get a 7D, So I bought a 7D, and then I bought 8 different lenses, just totally went ape shit, no fear of going totally broke and into debt. LED panels. At one point I got a slider, tripods, like a car rig to, hook the camera onto the car. And then I think it ended with like a Steadicam was one of the last big purchases I made. I convinced my company to rent a Red Epic, and then I'd shoot in low mode on a Steadicam. So I kind of was vaguely a DP, and that's where a lot of those skills really piped into the 3D work. And I love doing camera moves and lighting. Those are 2 of my favorite things.
It's so cool to think you got like sort of a bankroll to educate yourself on practical effects.
That's exactly what I tried to do. And at the company, I would also constantly down tutorials. Like once I discovered Grayscale Gorilla, I was like, all right, I'm going to watch all of these on the job. And it would piss them off. Like they'd go over my shoulder and be like, what are you doing? That's not work. I'm like, fuck you, dude. You don't know what this is going to help so much. Like, yeah, so.
I couldn't agree with that more. I think as we go into the future, we're all just going to be in a state of constant learning and relearning and learning. I think the idea of like go to college, get a degree, and now you're set, just use that for the rest of your life.
Yeah, no.
Is so far.
Yeah, I'm self-taught, so I love that kind of learning. And like, I just realized that you had Stuzor on, the other week, and I'm like, oh shit, and you guys are talking about me, and that's just so weird to me. But like, I'm going to go, I've got a job that I've got to do for the rest of the day, but, and I really would rather go watch all of your previous streams, because when I discover something like that, I just like down them all and get super excited. But so unfortunately, I got to do this other job, but then I'll watch it tonight probably.
Sweet. Man, speaking to Stuzor, yeah, it was awesome having him on the show, and we obviously were turned on to your work, but we thought off of his recommendation how much fun it would be to have you here on the show.
I super appreciate that, and it was really weird watching that part where he was like, "Oh, I could never do this." I'm like, "Give me a break, dude! Like, you just take one of your beautiful scenes and animate a camera through it, and that's it. Like, that's the only difference between, he's mostly doing stills and he does some motion, but like, I think it's just, we each have our own unique cocktail of skills that we learn along the way, but that can be all the difference in, impressing somebody else. Just because your work is different doesn't mean that you're more or less skilled. My work is different than his. That's all I'd say. And I totally look up to him and like see all the shit he posts. I'm like, man, I could never do a daily. Like, that wouldn't fit into my life. And also, like, this shit looks like Blade Runner. How did he do that in a day, or like that composition is beautiful. And so he's got this epic wide, massive look on all of his renders that sometimes I feel like I have, but he's totally nailed that down. He's got his Stuzor look and his style. So yeah, it's really funny hearing that kind of thing coming from other artists that are also your idols.
Yeah, man, that's super cool, and I love artists being able to team up. Have you gotten to work with Stuzor before?
Not yet, but we've passed each other jobs back and forth vaguely. But yeah, I would definitely love to work with him at some point. And I feel like there was this title sequence recently from Imaginary Forces that I feel like was totally the Stuzor look.
Well, let's talk a little bit. So Dave Matthews, cutting your teeth, getting everything going in Charlottesville. Where did you go next?
Yeah, I mean, we could talk a little bit about. So the coolest project I did for the Dave Matthews thing. Did you want to cover this? Was that DMB music video?
Yeah, the rooftop one. Yeah, so we played it, but let's pick that apart just a little bit. Cool. I know that right about here, so you handled the environments when he gets up on the rooftop.
Yeah. So this is one of those projects that was super out of my comfort zone. Like, I'd never done such an intense 3D tracking project, and I definitely have, I think, made my success by getting way in over my head on projects and doing things that seem impossible at the time, and gradually like unburying myself, getting myself into that feeling where I'm totally screwed and it's never gonna work. Like, taking a big risk. Like this project, my art director friend, totally trusted me and came up with this concept with me in mind, but we actually built a big green screen wall and all these props. So it was mostly CG, like environment, and the song is Rooftop, and it's a little on the nose that he's on a rooftop, but so we had this whole big green screen wall in this warehouse that we built with tracking markers, and it was like taking a 3D tracking crash course for me. I'd seen a lot about it, but I'd never done it before, but I knew it was possible, and I had guides from like FX PhD on how to do it and that kind of stuff, so I was like, hell yeah, let's just do it, and yeah, those are the kind of things that really push you. There are certain landmark projects that really push you to what feels like the next level, and this was one of them. And I spent about 500 hours on it, I'd say. And yeah, I mean, it was funny. Like on set, the company owner was like, he didn't know anything about CG. He's like, dude, wouldn't it be funny if you were just pulling one over on us? And it's like, because the tracking markers looked like he'd unleashed his kids on the place, and he's like, what the fuck is this shit? It's like some kid party like in here, you're just you're just pretending to be some, know what the hell you're doing. So that was funny. And yeah, this project was my first like GPU. I was using Element 3D pretty heavily at the time. That was my first like GPU rendering obsession, and that was for all the background buildings, because at the time, I didn't know, I just got Octane. Like, I actually got Octane for this project, and on this project, I convinced my company to get a Quadro K5000, which I thought, oh, this is the best card, right? It's the most expensive. It's nearly $2,000, so it must be the best for this, and that turns out not to be true. The gaming cards are way better, way more bang for your buck. The Quadros, have better drivers, but for Octane, they're definitely not better. So yeah, just making some of those like initial mistakes with all that, but so I used Octane for the hero building, and then I don't know what else. It was just a really cool, fun project. We bought this $3,000 blow-up balloon of Dave Matthews and chucked it off a parking garage towards the camera, and then I reversed that for the shots where he's falling, so it's just like falling away from the camera, and then I used a take where it contacts the building. Like, there's one take where it rolled down the building, and I was like, oh, I'll steal that, because you're always looking for those moments of CG and practical interacting, and because this practical balloon is deforming and getting squished against the building, and I was essentially replacing that building with a CG building, that was just one extra thing to bring those two worlds together and make it feel like the practical thing is contacting the CG thing. So you're looking for those moments of interaction. So that sold it better. And then, yeah, on set, there were some funny stuff. Like my favorite VFX tool is just a leaf blower because it creates wind, you know. And I've been on shoots where they didn't use a leaf blower. Like there was this one stupid video of this kid's bar mitzvah. It was this epic bar mitzvah intro where this kid's riding on a magic carpet, and like I told them to use a leaf blower and they didn't, and so his clothes are just totally static, and then I've got this carpet that's flapping in the wind and it just looks stupid. But yeah, so he was, you know, falling off this building and just flailing on an apple box on the green screen floor. And I was hitting him with the leaf blower and his weird, you know, hospital gown.
That's so rad, man.
It was fun, yeah. And,
I love how you talk about just diving in, you know, and I think like not knowing and pushing yourself to the point that it scares you. Someone said, totally. I can't remember, if your dreams don't scare you, you're not dreaming big enough. And totally. I love that idea of just like let's make some fucking mistakes. You know, let's push ourselves to the point where we fail, and only then will we know how much further we can go next time.
Totally, yeah. It's always paid off for me to be overly ambitious, I think.
Man, this is so wild, being that this was 2012. So then let's flash forward a little bit. You get out here, you start working
freelance.
You start working freelance. You take a jump, which is a very
natural that was scary for sure. I mean, it was made easier because my parents have always been extremely stable. I think it's harder for people that have, you know, several kids and no safety net. So I had a safety net, which meant I was comfortable like making that decision. I mean, it wasn't comfortable, but it was more. I think that makes it easier for sure. Yeah. And lately, I've been on a quest to help people really take that jump that are in those hard situations where they're just kind of burning out at their jobs. You know, it just makes me so angry some ways that, you know, companies manipulate people and keep them from posting their reels and just like, you know, make them dependent on them, and also just always grinding. You know, I just hate that feeling. So there's this great book by Joey Corriman called The Freelance Survival Kit, or something like that. And yeah, definitely look it up. It's like literally made for motion graphics artists and freelancers, and it's got the best advice. Like, I'm not that great at business, but it totally like condenses all of it. It's the best book on, you know, freelancing and business that I've ever read. So definitely check that out.
So then we flash forward, we jump into the great unknown of the freelance world, and you start working with Katy Perry or with Deadmau5.
That came a little later. So at first because I was in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is the middle of nowhere for freelancing and for all this kind of work, other than that one company I was talking about, I had to be an Uber generalist, right? So I started out like just taking on DIT jobs, which is digital imaging technician, which is just copying the footage and doing live color on set. I would take a lot of edit jobs, and then, you know, motion graphics and 3D jobs too, but that was like maybe 25% of the work. So it was just general, you know, filmmaking stuff, but all these jobs would lead to other jobs. Like even like I did a ton of 48-hour film contests, like maybe 10 of them, and those would lead to jobs. Like I would collaborate with people and then be like, oh, dude, you're so good at VFX, or you got all these skills, so let's work together, you know? And so, yeah, I just find putting yourself out there in all sorts of random situations and just immersing yourself is really what pays off. So at first it was word of mouth completely. You know, I didn't even have a site until I think a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. Wow. And yeah, I do. And that one-man band type thing, that Uber generalist thing, actually became its own niche. You know, it became a job description, because I would get hired by, when the work started getting more professional, I would go to Richmond and get hired as like a generalist, you know, basically managing the whole post of a spot. So I'd do the DIT, I'd do supervised editing in front of an ad agency, you know, folks, and then I'd do supervised color, and then I'd do like the VFX removal type stuff, motion graphics, and then I would deliver. So all of that like meant that I was just the one point of contact for the agency, and it simplified everything for them and meant that I could also charge more. So that was like a great deal for me and a great deal for them. So that was my work for a long time. And then, you know, yeah, within this, I think the thing that really, you know, pushed it more towards just C4D and Octane. I mean, part of it was this rebrand on the website, but I got the opportunity to release this space-themed music video that was going to be a 4-minute full CG music video. The budget wasn't great. It was like 15 grand, but so that's not quite enough to sustain me, you know, for 4 months. I mean, in Charlottesville, that stretches a lot further, so I did have to pick up some additional client work. And yeah, I rendered it all at home. And at first on, and like I would kind of work on, in 3 different contexts, like in each of my PCs. I had 3 PCs at the time. And I've got way more graphics cards and madness going on right now. But the way that I work is by kind of designing in each, context on each machine and then setting it to render overnight. So I just rendered all that stuff at home. And yeah, this project was like what I call my holy trinity, which is like fully, full creative control, an extended timeline, and a decent sized budget. So it's like very rare to run into that perfect storm of, awesomeness. So yeah, I think that one project was another one of these ones like the Dave Matthews Band Rooftop that really pushed me to the next level, where I got to like sit there for 4 months and, and create somewhat of a style, like play with sci-fi stuff. And it's kind of gotten me typecast to some degree, which is actually a good thing. Once like, it's like the people you're doing, he did his daily project every day for a long time and it generated momentum and his skills and his style. And then that became the thing that clients would come to him to generate more of his own style. So it's like taking deeper cuts into that one thing, if that makes sense.
I think that's a huge point. Yeah, go on, please.
Cool. And so, like, yeah, I mean, Katy Perry and KFC and, Dead Mouse to some degree have all approached me for similar space-themed, visuals. Like Katy Perry, I did the intro to her show recently, which was super cool. I felt, super honored to do that. And it's cool because I've like looped back around to concert visuals, which is kind of where I got my start. So it feels like coming back to home, but then in this much better way where, CG isn't a dirty word and, my skill set's improved a ton and I've got way more, I've got a lot of creative control. So yeah, it's definitely cool. And to be doing that higher profile, like, concert visual work. Right. And it's a great medium because a lot of the time the artists give you a lot more flexibility, and it's more like working with just one point of contact versus like some big production company in the middle, that's and several layers of revisions and stuff. So I much prefer, if I can, to be working with just one artist. Like with Dead Mouse, that's like the ultimate thing. It's just you're just working with Dead Mouse. You're going, went to his place in Toronto and worked with him directly. And so there are fewer revisions because you're right there in the room together, and because there's not like an ad agency in the way and several clients sticking their fingers in it, so that totally takes the timeline from like, what takes me 1 week would take like 3 or 4 times the amount when there's a lot more people involved, I've created about 10 Octane tutorials in the past year for his channel. And yeah, that's led to a lot of good things too, because when you give back to the community like you guys are doing with releasing, either just resources for people like, your KitBash packs, they cost money, but they're extremely cheap with how much you're getting. You're getting this whole world to play in, which is a huge base to start. You can reuse these assets and design them how you like. But when you give stuff to the community, whether it's free or, a good deal like with you guys, or whether it's creating tutorials, that generates a lot of momentum and attracts people to your work and your site. So that's a really good way to get eyeballs on your stuff. And that's one way that I've transitioned from just being this word of mouth thing to people contacting me all the time through my site, which is fucking awesome and means that I can work remotely, pretty much from anywhere. Like, it doesn't matter that I don't have to be in San Diego. I could be anywhere and still doing the work that I love, which is really empowering and cool.
Yeah. Well, speaking about the holy trinity of getting to work and make things creatively, this Immortalis video that you did, how did this one come about?
So this was this Spanish composer named Ivan Torrent and he contacted me out of the blue. He's in Spain. And it was just this great collaboration with a 3-week turnaround. So the kind of stuff he wanted was pretty intense for just 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But having that space music video under my belt, I think helped a ton with, just speeding me up at that kind of look. And he wanted the space stuff as well. And that short turnaround actually turned out to be a benefit in some ways because we both wanted to make like the coolest thing possible within that time frame. But then I could turn around and use that deadline to reel him in when his ideas went beyond the scope of what we could actually accomplish, and communicate that certain changes would derail me, and then we wouldn't hit our deadline. So he and I kept moving forward together, and so that's like my perfect client relationship idea. A lot of the time these indie clients are just the freaking best, and like they're not necessarily like this guy was really educated. He came to me with a ton of imagery already and a ton of references and inspired me the whole way through. But even like indie clients that are dumb and don't know what the hell they want and are not dumb, but like are not educated about the process can be great because it's still just one point of contact. Maybe they're easy to impress, or they're just like, I don't know what the fuck to do. You're the genius at this. You do it. So, and that produces a blank slate, but I'm comfortable in that environment, So yeah, I like doing that. I like having that full creative control is so important. And recently I have been getting higher profile jobs, but a lot of the time they become way more stressful because I'll render 20 shots and make it how I would make it, and then they'll be like, this is awesome, but not what the client wants, so you got to redo this whole thing. And it just feels like spinning my wheels and getting stuck. And the end result isn't necessarily cooler for it, and I've spent 3 or 4 weeks rather than the 1 week, and I've been up doing way later hours and working on the weekends, which I don't like doing, and stuff like that.
Yeah, man, I totally hear that. Sometimes the bigger fish just makes it more complicated because more people are involved.
Totally.
Well, David, do you have a project file that we could crack open for this Immortalis one?
Totally. Yeah, let's take a look at that.
So this project, you had 3 weeks to turn the whole thing around.
Yeah, and I was going to say, with 3 weeks, I want to take all the shortcuts possible, so that's why KitBash is so great, because this is like one of the biggest shortcuts. Like, I cannot model these buildings. I really want to learn modeling, but so far I've been focusing on like lighting, texturing, camera movement, rendering. That's the kind of stuff I'm good at, and modeling is just a world unto itself. So if I can get like a high quality base to start with, that's what I reach for. Like, I'm always reaching for Turbo Squid. Like on a lot of these projects, like the space one, I was like, we need a bit of like $2,000 at least for just stock, so we can get these cool models that I can then fix up and texture and relight and make them more moody and interesting, and basically KitBash my way through everything. So that's kind of been my mindset all through, it's like, it's like to some degree it feels preset-y, but it's also just like the process of art directing and more general, like larger scope management of stuff, and how I'm able to produce things quickly, is by just taking those shortcuts. Like the whale animation, I've done some character animation projects and they're really fun, really learn a ton through them, and I love that process. But if I were to have done that for the whale, it would have taken another week or two, So I found the best whale on Turbo Squid that I could find, which was like $700 or $800. And I'm like, I don't care. Like, that's going to save me. That's way more than, I'm getting way more value out of that. And like, we set aside, for this Immortalis project, we set aside $1,000 for stock. So that was most of the budget, but that was fine. And then the rest of the budget was just this KitBash Art Deco pack,
Super rad, man. Here is the Art Deco pack. I want to ask, how did you find it? How did you hear about the KitBash?
I learned Squared probably. I mean, I've been tuned into Learn Squared and also tuned into the Octane Facebook group, and it's all over there. And then, at some point I just followed you guys on Facebook, and I see everything that you release, and I've bought a couple packs, and they're fantastic. Yeah.
Well, awesome, man. Take us through a little bit of how you built this city for your piece.
These are all just hand-placed buildings. I'm not using like any symmetry objects or anything like that. And I've got one. I mean, I don't even know what to say about like how I organize these. It's not very smartly designed or anything. It's just like big building in the middle and then some other buildings on the side, and it's kind of like a tower. And then I put a couple more buildings here. It's just like not that well thought out, but it's good enough to look cool, for what I need. And then I've got this other thing sitting here to really fill it out. So I'm going to turn this on, and this is going to load for a second here. Cool. It's an Octane scatter. So I don't know if you're familiar with Octane scatter, but it's basically like the cloner in standard C4D MoGraph, except on crack. It can handle a ton more instances. That's really the only benefit of scatter, is that you can go crazy with the geometry. So here I've got 10,000 instances of your buildings, wow, and I could crank that up to 1 million and it wouldn't stutter, Wow. So that's like a huge, huge benefit of Octane scatter, and specifically Octane in C4D. I don't think that this exists anywhere but C4D version of Octane, which is one of the reasons it's way more popular in C4D than any other 3D package. Mm-hmm. So if I zip around here, you can see I'm seeing all this in real time. And this is my machine with just two 980 Ti's to give you an idea of the firepower here. That's not even that great. Like I've got a machine to my left with four 1080 Ti's and a machine to my right with two 1080 Ti's and a 980 Ti. So I've got 9 cards total, but this is just 2, and it's pretty responsive. Here. So I've got HDRI Link, which is a plugin from Grayscale Gorilla, which just lets you quickly load in HDRIs. But I like to split them out to where one is like the back plate and another is responsible more for the lighting. And then also I've got an Octane sun. So I find in big outdoor scenes, I almost always want to have a sun because you get more of a direct light look and a bit harder shadows. HDRIs notoriously create flat lighting, and that pisses me off. So I tend to mix HDRIs with daylight systems. So here, if I turn off this backdrop, so I've got it set to visible environment and only a backplate. So that's just like, so I can art direct what the pretty background looks like, and I can expose this up and down. Like if this is too blown out, which in this case without the buildings, it's totally too blown out. So I can bring that in and we can see a little bit more detail there in the sky, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's not really affecting the lighting, whereas this one is. And if I turn this one off, you can see there's nothing. And the sunlight here is set to mix sky texture, which allows you to mix in an HDRI. Without that, we get some crazy colors. I think that's due to this. See, for instance, here with this one that looks pretty in the background, right? If I set that to primary environment, this would cast a lot more reflections on the buildings. And I didn't like this look here. This is like bringing out the grunge texture too much. And it didn't look as nice to me as this. And this was achieved by just rotating this same HDRI. It's the same HDRI twice, but this one is like all transformed weird and desaturated. I've got a color correction node in there. And then like in here, there's a UV transform and I've just like scaled it down and transformed it. So like if I move it around, you can see that there's still something back there. It just happens to be showing one weird part of the sky that's pretty blank. But again, that's just giving this like kind of bluish cast to the fill light. And then this is creating a more interesting background. And this daylight is really what's catching the side of these buildings and creating something that looks a lot more interesting to me. So without that, things are much more flat. But then when you add that in, you can see you get this nice glow. And then I always my mindset has become getting far away from compositing, actually. Like I used to do a lot more compositing. I would do like motion blur, shallow depth of field, color grading, all the things in post, because that's what I was taught. But with Octane, my mindset has totally shifted to a more Pixar kind of approach where you can solve everything in 3D. And so I did almost no compositing on this whole piece. Wow. I did noise reduction, and that's it. And maybe there was one like cross dissolve that I did in After Effects, right? So all of it, like the motion blur in 3D looks better. The shallow depth of field in 3D looks better. The bloom in 3D looks better because it's reacting to where the sun is and the various light sources. And it's not just, this bloom isn't just picking the highest highlights. It's not exactly the same as if you were just to put a glow on in post. So it's reacting to the 3D stuff. Like the next evolution of that would be lens flares in 3D versus having to do Video Copilot's optical flares, and track those lens flares onto whatever your light sources are. It would be really nice to have like true 3D lens flares that track wherever your light sources are without having to worry about that. So I love when that all can get integrated more and more. Like one new revision that's coming is the ability to add custom LUTs. LUTs are lookup tables, so basically color grades, and I've got some of my favorites from doing color grading, and I'm going to be shortly able to integrate those. But here there's already, there's a set of default LUTs, and most people say, oh, do linear, make it flat so you can grade in post, which is true if you're working in a pipeline or other artists that are doing the color grading. But if I'm responsible for everything myself, I want to be seeing this as my final picture. I can just do everything right here, so why not, Yeah. And there are tons of controls in here to do that, and I can flip through and see these different profiles. Like maybe this is an interesting look. It's too crushed, so I can boost the gamma, and then bring down the exposure and play these against each other. And maybe it's too warm, so I can go to the white point and I can shift this orange and it'll go against that. So it's like a white white balance type card. Okay, that's 2 blue, so let's push towards blue. Oh wait, that's way too magenta, so let's go the other way. But you get the idea. There's like a ton of controls here to do that kind of stuff. So that's a totally different look. And you can see, there's flat, and I don't like working flat. I like seeing contrasty,
Yeah. I want to point out that I missed him pop in early on, but Mitch Myers is in the room. Mitch Myers, what up, dude?
I love that dude. Yeah, you got to get him on this stream too.
That is a great idea. David. And Crossfader says, when lighting in Octane, do you use physical objects with light materials or actual lights to create your light rigs? Do you also use realistic setups?
Yeah. So in this case, there's not. I could have like little lights in the windows, but since this is an outdoor scene, it doesn't make sense to have the geometry emitting light. There is that going on up here. There's like this weird beam that's supposedly attracting the whales to the city, up here. But yeah, I like using, like, for sure in like my interior scenes, if you've got some kind of piece of geometry that can become a light, it's really great to just take all that and add a black body emission to it and have it emit light, and then you get a very natural look. And then I'll go in and try to create a rim light on my main character and draw the eye towards whatever's the most important part of the scene. And then also kind of play with shadows and creating interesting shadows as well.
Super cool. Schmoopy actually answered your second question, David, which is something I think is so cool. When members of the community, I watch this in the chat all the time while we're going here, members in the community will answer questions for each other and be super helpful. I think that's one of my favorite things about this particular community is how open and welcoming everyone is to one another. So Crossfader says, David, do you use any render farms for Octane or do you only render locally? And then Schmoopy says, David sometimes uses black body emissions to light objects, but he designs a ton of his lighting by hand. His background...
This is how awesome my fiance is. She like knows all the terminology, even though she's not, she's a photographer and a bunch of other things, but she's not, actually part of this world. But it's awesome that she's that educated on it.
That is beautiful. I love that. And her name is Schmoopy. So good.
Yeah. I mean, her real name is Chelsea, but Schmoopy is another inside joke because the Brograph dudes it's from Seinfeld. We're pretty affectionate online, and so she's Schmoopy. It's just what it is.
That's so cool, man. Well, thank you, Schmoopy, for being here with us. BNQP is in the house, and he says, this is awesome. I'd love to hear how you handle volumetrics and fog in these sort of scenes.
Right. That's a big one for sure. I mean, that's kind of a pain in the ass, especially to demo live. I can show you a little bit in the next scene, and I could create like a little test scene to show that a little better because the volumetric boxes in this were pretty massive because they had to cover all the way to the horizon. So that meant the voxel count had to be extremely high, meaning really big voxels, otherwise things would crash. I think in general, Redshift might be a bit better at handling volumetrics, though Octane's working on it, and I wasn't going to shift to Redshift for this project, so because that's just a can of worms and would take a ton of time to learn. And I'm so comfortable in Octane. And I mean, you can get a beautiful result with Octane. It just takes a long time to load those volume boxes. But I'll show you a little bit about that in a little bit. Cool. I think what I want to show next, so I've kind of broken down the lighting on this scene. And then there's a bit of this texture here. I'll show this real quick. So you can right click and select material. And then I'll go into the node editor here. It's really simple. I did this in, I'll show this here. So it's just like some crappy trap code form like stuff. Some, what are they called? Just like caustics type look, not very interesting, but some kind of magical energy. But when you take that kind of thing and wrap it around something like the whale, it brings it to life a lot more because you see it deforming with the whale. Mm-hmm. So it's this animated texture. It's just a sequence. So in here, there's an animation, and you basically render out a JPEG sequence or a PNG sequence, and you set your start and end frames and the frame rate, and then it'll play back. And so I've just got this both piped into a black body emission, so it's emitting light a little bit, and I think it's mixed with a glass texture. So it has glass-like properties, and it's, I think, just mixed more towards looks like it's mixed more towards the black body. I don't know what the hell I did. I could tweak this and, now this I think is mixed more towards the black body because that's coming out more. And then if I go all the way this way, it's just a glass, right? So yeah, and that's just playing back, that sequence there. And yeah, I think next what I want to do is I'm going to shut this rendering down. Oh, and the last thing I wanted to mention is, so there's just a crappy looking landscape back here, and that's what I'm cloning, that's what I'm scattering all those buildings onto. So really simple, just C4D default landscape, scattering the buildings on there.
Cool.
And that filled it out a little bit more. But I want to talk about camera animation. Like, so for instance, so here's the camera move, and let's make this a little bit bigger here. I'm just going to shut this down so it's not distracting. So here is the camera move. And so this has got like an Alfred Hitchcock Vertigo feel, or known as a Zolly, which is a zoom dolly. So this is an effect achieved by either zooming in and dollying out, or the reverse, where you're dollying in and zooming out at the same time. And you get this kind of interesting perspective warping. I don't know if you're sensing that, but it's basically just animating the focal length. And it's a really easy trick, and I thought it brought more life to this move. So let me show you what it looks like without that. So say we had, let's just drop in a camera here. And let's start, right now we're on a 36, which is the default. Let's start long. So a lot of the time, longer lenses, I feel, give more of an epic sense of scale because they compress everything, you know.
Flat.
So say we just do a really simple thing, and I like to keep my default keyframes under, so I get here by going Control D, which is gets you to the project settings, and under my key interpolation, I like to set it to linear here, because it's just an easier default to work with. Otherwise, you get easing all the time, and with camera moves especially, it pays to have things linear. A lot of beginner moves that I see have eases on the beginning and end, and those are unmotivated eases. So that's like a pretty common, like, just, you know, not mistake, but something that people do because it's the default, you know? Just like people start usually with that 36 millimeter preset and don't think to change it. So you can actually dynamically change it by holding down 2 and right clicking, and you can see that my focal length here is changing adaptively, so I like to do that. So I'll start with like a, I don't know, 100 mil lens, and I'll frame up here, and I can kind of get, make sure that I'm centered by, you can right click, see I'm like on this axis here, I can right click and set that to 0, set this to 0, so that's fine. Maybe I do want to be actually a little panned upwards to catch the top of that building, so that's all good. And I'll just set a keyframe here at the beginning, and I'll go to the end, and I'm going to fly through, like I did, you know, on that move, fly through this archway, or this bridge, you know, that I've kind of just put in the middle of the scene because I thought it looked interesting, you know, and symmetrical. All these elements are symmetrical. So fly through the bridge, go up to the window, set our keyframes there, so you can see just simple linear keyframes, and this is what the move looks like. And my issue with this is that, well, first off, it feels like when you get closer to things, it feels like it starts to speed up towards the end, which you don't necessarily want. And I wanted to spend more time passing through this thing, if that makes sense. Like, this element felt cool to fly through, but not on a long lens, because when you're flying through something, I feel like you get a much greater sense of, you know, perspective and something rushing by you when it's wide. It literally stretches out the perspective, so it feels like you're flying through it for a longer period of time, and also just gives you that rushing sense a little bit more. So this is the move on a long lens. Okay. Let's do the same thing on a wide. So let's just duplicate this camera, pop into here. Actually, we're just going to kill the keyframes. I hold down Control and Shift to kill those and just kind of paint down. And let's go out to a wide. So let's look and see. Let's do a 24. So 24 mil lens, and we're going to obviously have to come in to reframe and get a similar perspective here. Okay. And let's set that's an okay-ish starting point. Let's see if we can, that's fine. Set keyframes there, and then let's zoom on in, and now you're feeling, see, as we're going through, it's like there's more space to cover through there, right? All right, so there's that, and here we go. Now this is wide. And I think in this case, this works a little bit better. But yeah, the idea is that I could animate from that from one to the other, you know? So yeah, the easy way to do that is, I mean, we could create a camera morph. That's one way to do it, but I'll just start on this longer one because that's basically what I want. And then by about this point here, I'll animate to, a 24. So let's do that same thing. So let's go back to our object, focal length, set a keyframe, and then go to this point here, and I'll just hold down 2 and right click and get it to 24. And now we'll have this sense of things. Do you feel how, let me hide these other cameras so that they don't kind of interfere, but do you feel how this stretching is happening here?
Totally.
Just a little more epic. Now, this is creating an even bigger rush towards the end, which I don't like. I don't want to slam in like that, and I do want to push further. So let's just go into our keyframes, and a lot of this is just messing around, playing with keyframes. So this is our Z here, so I'm just going to pull it. Whoa. Okay, so here is an interesting thing. So I'm going to have to redo this real quick because right now, this could work, but I would have to dial these against each other because my camera isn't perfectly centered in the scene. This is something you can run into where my Z is actually this axis, which is a diagonal. So that's not helping me animate at all. And I could tweak it and until it lines up. If I wanted to push further, I could go here and then mess with X to try to but it just becomes really annoying, if that makes sense. So what I can do is I can delete this animation, not the focal length change, that's fine. And I can go to my freeze transformation here, and whatever these coordinates are going to get stored. But now I've zeroed out everything so that my Z now becomes this perfect, wherever, this could all be totally askew, which it is. I often don't pay attention to world 0, but now my Z is a single parameter that I can animate, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally, dude. That is super rad.
Great. So now I just push on through this building here and up to about here. And there we go. And now, okay, so we've got a similar thing. We're pretty centered up. That's close enough. And now let's go back to our keyframe. So now we can really play with these a little bit. So now my Z, if I just mess with this, it's doing that, which is good. So now if I just go to position Z, I can set an ease on this. So I don't want to fly in so hard at the end. So I'll put an ease on it, but I don't want to come to a stop. So I'll have this tangent a little bit like this. And then the start, I thought this made it a lot more interesting and see how this feels like it's backing up. It's not, that's just the focal length change. But I want this kind of if we go back to look at the video here, this is what I did. If you see how that there's this kind of rush forward at the beginning, I liked the energy that gave. So all I have to do is bend this upwards here. So that's basically what I'm doing there. It's just, I'm just creating this, ramp inward, and then it kind of levels out, if that makes sense. So it's starting really fast, and then it's slowing down, which gives it this epic feel. Now, somehow we're missing the top of this building, so I can just go to my position Y here, and I don't necessarily want that to change, so I can just delete this and then set a new keyframe here I'm using Q. I don't know if that's the default. I changed the defaults a lot. And then I'll zoom in so it's not so sensitive. So I'm just holding down 2 and zooming in, and now when I drag this, I can kind of reframe where I want this so that now we're flying through these. And it's also a little off on the X, so I'll do a very similar thing, which is just solo the X. I don't want any change in that, so I'm going to delete that as well, and then hit Q and just mess with this a little bit until it feels perfectly centered. So now we've got this rushing forward, and that's going like that, and that's a little bit cooler. So next, I want to tweak that focal length animation, so I'll go to Animation, Show Track, and just grab the focal length. And this, I don't want this to be linear, and I don't want it to be over the course of the whole thing. So I'll drag this a little back, and I'll set my keyframes like that. And this one too, I want it to rush inwards, so we sense it a lot more at the beginning, and then I want it to level out perfectly. And this handle, you can drag it perfectly. You can drag it on its tangent by holding down Control and Shift. So I can get that kind of, leveling out at 0 nicely. So now, and I want this to jump off even more. Let's try this. Boom. Right?
Yep.
That's a little different even than how I had it, in the original, but that's kind of interesting too, where you really sense that stretching at first, like what the hell is going on? I mean, maybe that's too much. If we want to make it more like the original, it would be more like this, somewhere around there. And then adding in a little bit of camera shake really helps sell the weight of it. So if I just right click and go to this basic ass tag called vibrate, I can pop on some rotation, and I just want like 0.02 or let's do 0.05. I want more on the Y. I don't know if I necessarily want any of the Z because that's more of the roll axis. So maybe I'll keep that at 0, but just that little bit. And I want maybe a frequency of like 15. So this is times per second. It's like wiggle in After Effects, but just that little change. Do you feel that weight a little more? And then, one final thing that I might do to change this up and not make it like so much like the original is, say I start, so I can come to my coordinates here and pan up and down. So say I start panned a little bit downwards here and set a keyframe and then come to the end. And then we could look up at the building here, right? So now that's obviously wrong, right? So you want that to only happen towards the end. So I'll come back in here and go to my rotation and, set these both to E's here. And then, so at the end, we want it to come in. So something like that. Let's see, this might slam in a weird way. See, it's just going to like skyrocket there. So that's not what we want either. So we have to play these values kind of against each other a little bit. And we could maybe set a third keyframe here so that it stays level until around here. So let's just grab all these and hit this here. So maybe it's more like that. And then this one, I try to keep these like in line rather than, because having these weird S-bends will create an inconsistent motion. I want this to kind of level out to where it's moving linearly towards the end. So now we're pivoting and doing that kind of thing, which is kind of cool. It's not exactly what I'm trying to get. I've got one from last night that I created that I think is more interesting. Let me see if I can find it. Not this guy. No, that's the one I just did.
Well, it's cool seeing you build this and seeing how much, just testing there is. And how often
I think this is the one that I made last night. This one kind of pivots a little more naturally around, like reveals this building a little bit earlier and stays pivoting on this. You want to kind of keep like whatever object you're trying to highlight. Say it's this building. I want to be pivoting, like not falling off of it. So at some point we're like moving forward, and at some point we start to find the next thing that we're going to pivot on, and we kind of stay focused on that. So it's a play between moving in Z and rotating the tilt, essentially.
Super cool, man.
Cool. All right, so let's move on from the camera animation stuff.
Okay.
So let's bring back our Octane window here, and I'll fire this up. So I've kind of stripped this scene down because the load times do get a little bit heavy with all of the buildings in there. Probably like we would have to sit around and wait for like a minute. So I just kind of took that down to some degree. And in this case, I've got a similar thing where, and let's find this shot in the edit real quick. It's like a long lens orbit essentially. So yeah, this is just a little bit on texturing, and honestly, I think I copped out on the texturing on this building. I found it's really freaking simple on this one. So I'll show a little bit more of a complex texture that I think looks even better that I made maybe last night. But this one I just jammed through and found something that was good enough. And that's actually a note I wanted to make on the last one too. Is I didn't show this, but the grunge texture that's on it looks pretty shitty when the whole video is, when the motion blur is off. So the motion blur on that one, because we're flying in, I knew that I didn't have to do much with the texture. Like as long as it was metallic and you sensed a bit of like some kind of grunge that, Ivan had asked for. Like at first we were going with just like a gold, like just a pure gold, but then we went for a little bit more worn look. But yeah, what was I saying? I forget.
You're talking about texturing it.
Yeah. I think, the textures could look like you need to know, or it's helpful to know what you can get away with, basically. So in that case, because we're rushing by all the buildings and not focusing in on them, I could get away with just letting the motion blur cover that up, and it felt still pretty real and epic and, more than enough. It was, that's just what was required, basically. So here, let's kind of punch in a little bit. So first off, actually, the volumetrics here, this is one just gigantic, very thin layer. You can see how far this extends. And this is actually loading really pretty nicely, but it's just this thin box, and it's the default. Everything above the clouds was a fog volume. So Octane has this button here for one of these two. No, that's the VDB. So that lets you load in VDBs, and the other one is fog volume. If you want to find it, it's under Objects, Octane Fog Volume. So, and that's basically just a box with volumetrics in it, and then you can use a default C4D noise to create some kind of cloud look. And in this case, I'm just using. You can see it's like super huge. And in the case where you've got a really big fog volume, you need to set the voxels really high. So in this case, it's 555, where the default is like 2 or 3. Like anything below this will crash the fuck out of my computer. So you gotta be careful with this. And then there's also a multiplier here that can help, that only works on render time. So if you set this to like 2 or 3, you'll increase the detail, and that won't affect the viewport, which gets really bogged down, which is definitely helpful. And I've got the edge feather up because one issue with this stuff is it can start to, even here, you can see it starts to look really geometric when you're further away from it, which isn't good. I don't like that there's a hard cutoff on these boxes. And so it's really useful when you're in it, when you're like in the box and like in the clouds, but when you're outside of it, you see this hard line. So there's a feather that I've cranked all the way up, which helps soften it to some degree. And then inside here, you just load a default C4D noise. In this one, I've got FBM. A lot of the time, I like electric, which gives you maybe more puffy clouds. I've got pretty high octaves, and then looks like I've cranked the global scale really high. And then you play with a high and low clip to get various looks. I don't know if I want to play with this that much for fear of, crashing stuff out. But yeah, that's how you can you see now we're getting more filled in clouds, and the more I pull this low clip up, here we'll create gaps, or maybe it's the opposite in this case. Let's see. Actually, the beam coming out of the building was just a displacement deformer on a cylinder, but the window texture is the same animated texture, and it's just like trap code form. It's just a simple ass like fractal type looking thing, and just like a looping whatever texture. It's not even looping. It's just like a really long animation, and I just piped it onto the whales. The whales were kind of a breakthrough for me because at first I was trying to do like that typical X particles follow surface look and getting particles to trace the animation, but I was having a really hard time. And then I was like trying to fill them with some kind of volume, like some kind of movement, like glowy inside particles, and that wasn't working well either. But then I was like, why not just wrap some kind of cool texture and let the texture do the work? And so it was a mix of that, and then there was like a Fresnel effect with a thin film shader, so you get kind of multicolored, like iridescent look on the edges. And at one point I stumbled onto, I accidentally made them semi-transparent, but that looked cool too. So they're weirdly semi-transparent in the space scenes. And then I also piped in like a gold fleck type material so that you catch these little sparkles as well on the tail. So yeah, that was the main thing that I did with the whales, other than I slowed down the movement a ton. Like the default movement was really fast and didn't make this, like if you want something to look big and sell the scale, you needed to move a lot slower. So I slowed down the movement a ton. I think I baked it out and slowed it down. And then retextured the whales. So there was none of the original UV maps, which weren't even working very well anyway. I was having trouble with that too because it was a model from Max and there was a bunch of conversion crap that I had to go through. But yeah, so that's about the whales. And then that volume box, I'm gonna turn it off for now. But that was the idea, high and low clip. I think when I took this down, usually I think this is somehow inverted, but usually when you clip it this way, you get fewer clouds. And more, kind of more holes in the clouds essentially. But yeah, so everything even if I go back here, and here's quickly, I'm just jumping around, but this shot, this next one here shows, there it is. This one I think shows off the texture the best. So this animated fractal texture, and I think I used video copilots like, what's that, Color Vibrance to create this kind of look here with the glowy stuff. So a lot of that's out of After Effects with this two-tone like cyan and blue. And originally I had it more of a purple, but he wanted this cyan to match his album art. And then these gold flecks are in there, and I think that gives it almost more life than anything else. And then I made sure to rim light, the whale. And then the last thing is that iridescent like texture is causing this rim light to go really cyan. So if I had just adjusted that thin film shader, then I would get lots of different colors. But I went with this cyan look. Cool. And then, because this is a transition between two worlds, and so you have to match up the two camera moves and, somehow get the cloud layers to blend. So that was tricky. But I was going to talk, I think, about this shot here. So again, this whole bottom layer was just one really long fog volume box. And then this top layer is just another big box sitting on top of that. So this whole shot is composed of just two large fog volumes. And then I've got my spaceship here with the KitBash3d stuff, and then that's the scatter buildings there that are giving it even more detail. And the spaceship I actually had from Turbo Squid that I purchased for my space music video, but we never ended up using it, so I just pulled it out for this one, and it worked well. I think I flipped it upside down and then used it as like the base or something. This is the next shot that I want to talk about with this texturing. The city, and I like this shot a lot because of the super long lens look, and how these whales, it just makes them feel really massive, and I loved working with Ivan Torrent because the music was also inspirational, and there are these hard-hitting moments, and he also adjusted things, like for the end resolve, where this hits, he like added in one of those like super bassy like So yeah, he was able to add in like whale sounds and little elements like that. So that was pretty sweet working with someone equally talented in a different realm.
I mean, sound effects can make everything.
Yeah, they totally made this piece like so much better. So let's just jump in here and I'll quickly show you texturing process. This isn't going to be this is not all that advanced. So I think that this one here is literally just a roughness map. So if we look at here, it's just this texture DR7 that's popular. I think it's from Raphael Rao, and it's crunched down with a gradient, and then that's it. Like, it's just a metallic shader, but I'll generate a little bit of a nicer one here for us to show like what my texturing process is. So I can just create a glossy material here, and I'll just overwrite it by holding down Alt and dragging it over top. Cool. And then come over here, and so to make a metallic material, I'll just set the diffuse to black and index up to 5 or greater. Or if you want a full mirror surface and go crazy, then you set it to 1. And I'm going to back out here because we don't need to be, I think we want to, you want to texture to some degree in the environment you're going to be, from the perspective of the camera. So, the lighting matters a ton. So, again, I'm always, going back and forth between the lighting and the texturing because they play together so, importantly. If this were front lit or lit from a different angle, it would totally change how much bump you're perceiving and all this other stuff. So you kind of want to play those two factors against each other, go back and forth until you arrive at the look you're going for. Same thing with even the camera controls, shallow depth of field, the contrast. So I kind of mess with all that stuff in unison to try to arrive at a look. And I also want to be aware of what my focal length is and how close I am to whatever that thing is to know how detailed I need the texture to be. So in this case, maybe let's get up a little bit closer and maybe pay attention to this wall here. So right now we've got just a simple metal. And if I were to make this rough, if we were to look at this, this is already pretty damn close to the final look. And you can see how much of that is generated just from the lighting, right? So that's this daylight here, again, mixed with, this one's the backdrop, this one is the primary environment that's, casting the fill, and then this is the daylight, which is causing that nice side lighting here and kind of backlighting. So at another angle, you get something totally different and not as nice. Like this looks shit, like this is really bad, so I tend to never go for front lighting because that flattens out. This is essentially, because even though we're using 3D objects, it's all being displayed on flat monitors, so it's still 2D, and you're trying to bring out those shapes and create that contrast between light and shadow. And when you front light something, it's like an onboard flash on a camera, where it just flattens out someone's face, and we don't really like that look. It's not attractive because you don't see the shape of the face. So you're trying to bring out these shapes essentially. And I didn't get into lighting until Octane, because Octane allows you to do this in real time, whereas before with like physical renderer, or these like CPU renderers, I mean, not necessarily like Arnold's, like a lot of these third-party render engines are awesome and they give you that same IPR, but the IPR is just everything, with this stuff, because it allows you to art direct in real time. So lighting was extremely hard before that, where, you'd tweak it and you'd like see one little peek into your image, like one little bucket forming, and you're like, oh, I guess that's not right. And at some point you just give up, and just, it's good enough. But here you can really, that's what really speeds things up. It's not necessarily the final render times, it's that art direction process and the back and forth and the ability to, make much higher level imagery because of this software.
David, we got a question I want to give you a shot at. Was the
Sure.
fractal animated map added in After Effects, or was it imported as an animated Octane texture?
So it was animated in After Effects, exported as an image sequence with that animation preserved, and then in Octane, I brought that in as an animated texture. Does that make sense?
I think so. That is from MIDI Glider.
Cool.
And Crossfader and Schmoopy gave some help too. Yep.
Haha, cool.
I love it.
So yeah, here I'm going to just start. So yeah, let's start with this rougher texture, because this is looking weird when it's like totally reflective. This looks pretty bizarre. So let's just bring it a little more rough, and then I'm just going to drop in a noise and pipe that into the bump. So let's just start designing a bit of an interesting bump. So to be able to see this, you can start to see it forming. Let's bring the contrast all the way up. Now you can really see what's going on. And you can also see, if we zoom in here, that there are these weird lines because it's set to UV mapping. So we want to change that to box mapping. So I'm going to change the projection here to box. And now it's looking a little bit better mapped. And you can see this is giving some kind of interesting relief there. It's too strong, so I like to have a mix slider in there, basically. So if I drop in a multiply, then I can just also drop in a float texture here, and then this becomes my mix slider. So this is essentially multiplying all this stuff by this. So the lower this is, the lower number it's going to get multiplied by, so it's going to be a lot more subtle. So I like to have this at the end of my node tree here, so I can kind of dial up and down the effect. So basically, this first thing is going to be my big noise, and I want more octaves, so it's a little more complex. So that'll give it a little more detail as well. And then I want a UV transform. So the UV transform just allows me to scale it, and I'm going to make this one pretty big chunkies. That's a technical term. Like that. And then, so I'm trying to create a kind of different regions of large scale texture and different regions of small scale as well. And maybe I can see this better if let's bring down the roughness a little bit here too. So that's the big one. And now let's just duplicate this noise setup here, so I can hold down Control and duplicate it. And I want to add in a mix texture here. So I'm going to be mixing these two together and piping this into that multiply. So the multiply comes at the end because that's our general, mix slider, like kind of an opacity. So I'll pop this in here. If you hold down Alt, you can get it to react and just insert that node. And so my texture 2 will be the big noise, and my texture 1 will be the small noise. And by default, you just get a slider that blends evenly between them. So let's just do that for starters. And this one, the transform, can be take that down to a smaller level. And here I want actually to control, I like, whenever I can, reducing the number of nodes. So here I can use the projection because it's the same type, it's box on both of these. And so here's an interesting thing. So I've got my small noise here, which is 0.35, whatever. And then I've got my big noise here, which is 1 or higher, maybe it's 3. And so those two are independently controlling the scale. But then in the texture projection node, we also have an additional control potentially for transform. So I could transform these two together. So this is like, you've got your individual controls for how they are in terms of scale relative to one another, and then you've got an additional control if you want to really just scale the whole thing up and down and keep that relative relationship. So this one's adding additional scale, but we're keeping, the relationship between the big texture and the small texture. Does that make some sense?
Yeah. Yeah. It's
cool.
Super cool.
So yeah, and then again, I've got that mix slider, and now I've also got an amount slot, and I could put a third noise into here, or I could put an actual image texture. So I'm going to go for an image texture, and this is going to drive, rather than just a 50-50 blend, this will create patchy regions where sometimes we're seeing the big scale and sometimes we're seeing the small scale. So this basically, whatever's white here will show the big scale, and whatever's black will show the little. Or I don't know if it's that exact relationship, but one and the other, So just reflection here. And then I want to crunch it down so that I'm making sure that there are hard areas of black and hard areas of white. So I can drop in a gradient, and that gradient you can just, slam together a little bit until we start to see something more interesting happening. Let's see. And sometimes it helps if you can't see what's going on to take this whole setup and also pipe it into the diffuse. See, there you go. And it looks horrible, ugly, but then you actually get more of an idea of what it is that you're creating. Like in this case, we also need that same projection type. So let's just drag that projection in there. And then we need a UV transform as well on our image texture. So now if I drag this up and down, we should see things start to change. I'm going to start. So this is where it's like, oh, not working. You start to get into just messing around with things until it looks the way you want it to. So I'm not seeing that big texture affecting things. All right, let's zoom in a bit here. So you can kind of see what I'm starting to talk about, where see this area here, you've got more of a small texture, and then this area you've got more big texture. Let's see what happens if we mess with this transform and bring it up. And this one even smaller. And maybe this isn't clipped the right way either. And also let's take our mix slider down. I think that's getting a little bit closer. I'm just looking for these patchy areas where you're starting to see really small details come through. So I still think that it's tweaking this gradient here. And sometimes you just have to really slam values to see a change. So that's looking much more interesting to me at that point. Some areas that are smooth and some that are, not. And it's not perfect. I have a tutorial on this, on my website. If you go to tutorials, it's part of my newest advanced shaders in Octane. But yeah, in addition to this, you could use the same thing as a roughness map. So I could see what it looks like if I, take this same thing and pipe it into the roughness. Then we'll get an even more different look where some areas are glossy and some areas are rough, or I can use a totally different roughness map. So if I take, this setup here and just duplicate it on over, and probably also will want a gradient, but let's do this, and you can see it repeating here. So that's bad. Let's up that. And again, we want to crunch it down with a gradient, drop that on there. And maybe we make this one much bigger. And then we don't necessarily want these to be fully reflective, so we can change this black point to be a little bit, more matte. So there are areas that are very reflective and others that are there are areas that are very rough and others that are just somewhat rough. But I don't necessarily, in this case, want to see areas of perfect mirror-like surface. And then this one too, you can see we've brought back this weird error with the UVs. So this one also needs that projection, so we can grab it from here if we want, like that, and that fixes that. And then we want to kind of pop back to our original perspective and see what this is all looking like. So we're getting some interesting like grunge on the buildings, and you know, from this vantage point you don't necessarily notice it as much. So that's where it matters to, you know, art direct for the camera. Like here we would maybe want to bring, you know, that mix slider up even higher, you know, so we can sense that texture more, you know. But yeah, that's in general the process of playing. And yeah, mixing those big and small scale also helps avoid repetitions, because you've got, you're overlaying, you know, noises and textures together in a way that creates emergent properties where you're not seeing those repetitions.
Man, cool. David, this is so awesome, man.
Thanks, dude.
I could really dive into a lot of this, and I definitely want to plug your tutorials as we wrap up here.
Cool, yeah.
But thinking about this, man, there's so many comments in the audience about how they could watch you do this for forever as well. But here as if you've got your website pulled up.
Totally. So ariavisuals.com/tutorials. So these are all the tutorials that I've created so far, and there's some presentations in there. This one from DFWC4D was a good breakdown on that space music video, so everything to do with that. This NAB one covers my ridiculous Star Wars Harry Potter thing, as well as this cruise ship music video, which was another big endeavor for the same musician as the space one. This overview is really good. I think people have responded really positively to that. And then some stuff on displacement, motion blur. People really like this futuristic city one. This is a really overdone but fun topographic type renders. And then I've got 2 on advanced shader creation. And so if you want to see a better breakdown of that, look at part 2. I've got that like a grungy gold that I show how to create. It's a little bit more comprehensive than what I just did. And then SIGGRAPH, I did a talk on digital DPing, so being a kind of digital cinematographer. And then also under my resources, this is another thing. This is going back to what I was talking about, where giving back to the community can really drive traffic to your site. So I think this one link, because I already was doing this for the longest time, like it was difficult to find Octane tutorials, and I was always scouring the internet and just obsessively collecting them in my brain, basically as like reference points to go back to for myself, you know. But I had all this information, so I basically at one point, you know, at first I piped it into a Google document, which was dumb, you know. It wasn't driving traffic to my site, and I just released it, you know, to the Octane Facebook group. But then Schmoopy over there convinced me to put it on my website and host it in a more professional way. So this is really driven, I think, my site views from like, I don't know, like 200 a month to over like 4,000 or 5,000, sometimes 10,000 a month. So I'm getting a lot more views on my site, which is great, and that's bringing in jobs, you know. So yeah, giving back to the community. So this is an extensive list of just every Octane tutorial I've ever seen, and you know, if you ever see any more that aren't on this list, hit me up and I'll put them on here. And I've got little descriptions about what I like about the various tutorials and whatnot. So yeah.
But man, thank you immensely for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on. I love the stuff you guys are creating, and it's so empowering for solo artists, you know, like myself, to have this super legit base to start building from, you know, like having a world to play in where you can just focus on the lighting and the texturing and the camera movement, versus painstakingly, you know, if I were to try to create a kit like this, obviously it would take like months, if not a whole like year. I mean, I don't know, just for me personally, like I haven't learned modeling yet, so I'm starting to. But yeah, so it's having these kind of resources is invaluable, and people are really gravitating towards this stuff, I think.
Well, thank you, David. Hearing you say that means a lot. For us, what we're trying to do is inspire and enable artists like yourself to do the things that they love, and to get into the painting process fast, and to help save people time and money in their workflow is the goal for us.
Totally, dude.
Well, thank you to everyone who has been in the chat. We had a really awesome talk. We talked about taking the leap from from studio gig to freelance world. We talked about building a personal brand. We talked about giving more than you get. We talked about having deadlines. And then we had some incredible tutorials here. Two different really cool sections from Octane Jesus himself.
Yeah, now I can't ever cut my hair because then I won't be Octane Jesus.
Yeah, right. Now you're stuck in your brand.
Screwed. I'm stuck with it. Yeah.
Well, awesome, man. Let's definitely let's talk more and let's figure out how to do this again, because this was outstanding, and I know there's so much awesome information in there that people would be dying to hear.
Sweet. Thanks a ton, man.
Yeah. Well, and to the chat, thank you all very much for your Drokey, one of our very very solid regulars here goes. It said that Bob Ross hates his perm but couldn't get rid of it because of his brand. So
that's awesome. That's
you're the
perfect.
Next Bob Ross. Yeah. On the next one, you'll have to like put in a little secret bush.
Yeah, exactly. The pretty trees, the fluffy trees, or whatever it is. Yeah.
Cool. JD, would you please post the Discord link? JD is moderating our Discord where so much has been going on in between our Tuesday to Tuesday streams, going down there on Discord. So join us and JD in that chat in the weeks between.